Hey, so in this lecture I want to talk about how we can improve the movement of the apple tree. Play this, and you may have noticed that when you go and play this game for a while and have it run through, that as soon as the apple tree reaches the edge of the boundary, that outer boundary, that is where it changes direction right at the edge of that boundary, it often changes direction again right after, and this can seem a bit buggy. So our goal in this lecture is to fix that. We can do that by setting up an inner boundary and disallowing the redirection, that random redirection, to happen when it is outside of that inner boundary. Before moving on, you may want to try this by yourself as an exercise. We already have that outer boundary set up where the redirection will happen. The apple tree will move in the opposite direction when it reaches that outer boundary. We also have some random redirection happening every second. There's a chance for the tree to redirect its movement to sort of confuse the player, right? Now, as I mentioned in this lecture, we want to set up an inner boundary, and the tree should only do that random redirection when it is within that inner boundary. Okay, so go ahead and try that as an exercise. Again, to recap, what we want to create is an inner boundary and an outer boundary. The tree will then only change direction randomly when it is within the inner boundary, and that will help avoid that weird behavior, that choppy behavior at the outer boundaries. So I will navigate to the tree base header, and I will create that float inner boundary. I will decorate that with the uProperty edit anywhere and in the category setup, and I will add a comment here. The tree is going to randomly redirect only if it is within the inner boundary. The reason for the setup is we want to smooth the redirection at the outer boundary. I will actually rename this float, the boundary, to the outer boundary, and back in the treebase.cpp, rename those boundary instances. Now I can use the find and replace each one of those using the next option until I have all of those replaced. Just check to make sure that you have all of those replaced. I will reorganize my initialization list, and I will set the inner boundary to 600, and I will actually modify the outer boundary to 900, but this is based on testing. You can change this if you wish. That is why we are exposing that to the designer. We do want quite some space between those, otherwise some of that strange movement at the edges will remain. Now, how do we go about solving this issue? How do we set that inner boundary up so that we only get the random redirection within the inner boundary? Well, I will navigate to the change direction function. I will select these statements and wrap those in an if statement, so we'll have to do a check. We want to check if it is within the inner boundary. Only then do we want to execute this logic. So we get the actor's current location and store that in a temporary vector. Then we check if that temp position .y is less than or equal to the inner boundary, and it is also greater than or equal to the negative of the inner boundary. In other words, we check if it is within that inner boundary. If it is within the inner boundary, then we can do the random redirection, and this should solve that choppy movement that we get at the outer boundary. I will build and run and test this out. One thing to think about, as you modify the speed of the tree, maybe for upcoming more difficult levels, then you also need to test that and potentially adjust the inner boundary accordingly. But again, you'll have to do some playtesting on that, and the goal again is to avoid that choppy movement that we get at the outer boundary.